On the outside, George Michael seemed untouchable, famous, adored, and endlessly successful. But when he was found dead on Christmas Day, one detail unsettled even his closest friends. He died completely alone. For months, the truth was kept quiet. Then came whispers, then doubts. And now, years later, his family and those who knew him best are finally addressing the question fans were never meant to ask. Was it really just natural causes? Behind the iconic voice and flawless image was a man carrying grief that never healed, love that never faded, and wounds that fame couldn't fix. A devastating loss in his private life changed him forever, and some believe it slowly pulled him into isolation. What actually happened in George Michael's final years, and why the people closest to him say the full story was never told, may change how you see his life, his music, and his death forever. George Michael had a rough childhood. George Michael's childhood didn't appear outwardly tragic, but it was shaped by emotional distance that left a lasting mark. Born Georgios Kyriakos Panayiotou, he grew up in a small London apartment with both parents, yet his father, an immigrant who ran a restaurant, was often absent. That absence created a quiet but painful gap between them. George later reflected that he was rarely shown affection or encouragement, saying he was never praised, never held, a reality far removed from the warmth people assume family life should bring. Music entered his life early. At just 6 years old, he discovered an old gramophone in the family garage and even tried writing his first song. Still, it wasn't until a serious head injury around the age of 8 that something shifted. After the accident, he became completely consumed by music, describing it as a sudden and overwhelming focus that felt almost instinctive. Even then, he kept those dreams to himself. He knew his father doubted his abilities and once remarked that he didn't think George could sing. That quiet disbelief only deepened the divide, and in time fueled George Michael's determination to prove himself through his art. George Michael had a serious drug problem. According to a Daily Mail interview with Wham's former manager Simon Napier Bell, George Michael didn't begin struggling with substance use until later in life, after his solo career was already well established. What started relatively late gradually expanded into a serious and wide-ranging habit. In September 2008, police found him in a public restroom in North London using crack cocaine and marijuana. Because the amounts involved were small, he was released without further legal consequences. Those close to him said drug use had become routine. Kenny Goss, Michael's partner for 15 years, later explained that finding drugs around the house was common, and he often flushed them away, only for George to assume he had simply misplaced them. Michael himself spoke openly about it in a 2009 interview with The Guardian, admitting that at the height of his addiction, he survived on little more than coffee and cannabis, smoking nearly 24 joints a day. By the time of that interview, he said he had reduced his intake to 7 or 8, a number that still hinted at how deeply ingrained the habit had become. George Michael's partner died of AIDS complications. In 1998, George Michael revealed in an interview with CNN that his first same-sex relationship began relatively late, when he was 27. Not long after coming to terms with that part of himself, he met the man who would leave the deepest emotional mark on his life, though their time together would be heartbreakingly short. The meeting happened in 1991 at a Wham reunion concert in Rio de Janeiro. There, George noticed Anselmo Filippa, a fan 7 years older than him. The connection was immediate. George later said he knew almost instantly that this was someone he could truly fall in love with, not just a passing attraction. Within days they were together, but only 2 months into the relationship, Anselmo became seriously ill, suffering from persistent flu symptoms and a rash. George feared what the diagnosis would be, and doctors soon confirmed it. Anselmo had AIDS. The two waited for the test results over Christmas Day in 1991, a moment George later described as the darkest and most terrifying time of his life. Throughout it all, they kept their relationship and the illness hidden from both family and the public. Less than 2 years after they met in March 1993, Anselmo suffered a brain hemorrhage during a medical procedure and died at just 36 years old. The loss devastated George, and it was a wound he never fully healed from. The death of George Michael's mother sent him into a deep depression. The loss of Anselmo Felipe left George Michael deeply broken, and the grief lingered far longer than anyone realized. Just as he was trying to survive that heartbreak, another devastating blow followed. In 1996, his mother, Leslie, was diagnosed with an aggressive terminal cancer. She managed to spend one final Christmas with her family before passing away in February 1997. George later admitted that her death shattered him spiritually in a way he wasn't prepared for. What followed wasn't just grief. It was something darker. George described sinking into a depression unlike anything he had known before, a weight that sat on top of his mourning and consumed him. He said it made him question the value of his own life and left him feeling empty and lost. Even years later, he confessed that he never fully recovered from Anselmo's death, and that the pain from those losses stayed with him, quietly shaping everything that came after. George Michael was arrested and forced to come out. For much of his career, George Michael guarded his private life carefully, not out of secrecy, but necessity. At a time when being openly gay could end a pop career overnight, he believed honesty came with too high a cost. Even after the devastating death of his partner, Anselmo Felipe, George kept that part of himself hidden. When he finally came out to the world, it wasn't by choice or readiness, but because circumstances forced his hand. In April 1998, George was arrested in a public restroom at Will Rogers Memorial Park in Los Angeles during a police sting. An undercover officer claimed to witness him engaging in a lewd act, an accusation George later said was the result of entrapment. He was released after posting a small bail, but the arrest made headlines worldwide. With his sexuality now the focus of public scrutiny, George decided to speak openly for the first time. He went on CNN and told reporter Jim Moret that he was gay, addressing the issue directly rather than allowing rumors and tabloid narratives to define him. He said he had no problem with people knowing he was in a relationship with a man and revealed that he hadn't been involved with a woman for nearly a decade. It was a moment of forced honesty, one that changed how the world saw George Michael and how he would live the rest of his life. George Michael survived some horrible car accidents. George Michael's long struggle with drugs eventually began to spill into the most basic parts of his daily life, including his ability to drive safely. By the mid-2000s, those issues were no longer private. In October 2006, police in North London found him slumped behind the wheel of his parked Mercedes, barely conscious. He was arrested on suspicion of impaired driving, and when the case reached court in May 2007, it was revealed that he had been under the influence of marijuana and GHB, a powerful club drug. He pleaded guilty and received a sentence of 100 hours of community service, along with a 2-year driving ban. The pattern didn't stop there. In the early hours of a Sunday morning in July 2010, police were called to a crash scene in North London after a vehicle plowed into the front of a Snappy Snaps photo shop. The driver was still inside the wrecked Range Rover when officers arrived. It was George Michael. Marijuana was found on him, and later blood tests confirmed he had been driving under the influence. He pleaded guilty once again and was sentenced to 8 weeks in High Point Prison, ultimately serving about half of that time. Even after prison, danger continued to follow him. In 2013, Michael was seriously injured on England's M1 motorway when he fell from his moving car, reportedly while attempting to fix a door that hadn't closed properly. The incident was severe enough that he had to be airlifted to a hospital and treated for a head injury. By that point, it was clear that substance abuse had moved beyond personal struggle and into repeated life-threatening situations, each incident adding another layer to the quiet decline behind the fame. George Michael almost died of pneumonia in 2012. George Michael's Symphonica tour across Europe in 2011 was meant to be a refined, triumphant return, but it quickly became overshadowed by serious health scares. As the tour progressed, he was forced to cancel or postpone multiple shows after suffering a series of alarming medical emergencies. In October, he pulled out of a highly anticipated performance at London's Royal Albert Hall after being diagnosed with a viral infection and a dangerously high fever. The concert was rescheduled for the following month, but even then, he never made it to the stage. Just 2 hours before a show in Vienna, Michael collapsed and was rushed to the hospital. What followed was far more serious than anyone expected. He was admitted to AKH Hospital with severe pneumonia, a condition doctors later described as life-threatening. Several tour dates were immediately postponed as he remained hospitalized for weeks, fighting to recover. He wasn't discharged until well into December, and the experience left a lasting mark on him. Michael later described the ordeal as a near-death experience. Physically, he survived, but emotionally, the impact lingered. In the months that followed, he struggled with intense anxiety that made performing increasingly difficult. The fear became so overwhelming that he eventually canceled a planned 9-day tour of Australia, admitting he simply wasn't mentally able to step back on stage. George Michael overdosed several times toward the end of his life. Although George Michael's struggles with substance abuse occasionally played out in public, through arrests and highly publicized incidents, the depth of his addiction was far more serious than most fans ever realized, especially toward the end of his life. Those close to him later suggested that constant access to drugs made recovery incredibly difficult. A longtime friend said that once addiction takes hold, it becomes a relentless battle, and George was fighting it largely out of sight. According to people within his inner circle, the danger was real and ongoing. One source revealed that Michael had been rushed to emergency rooms multiple times after overdoses, sometimes narrowly escaping death. His drug use went beyond what was publicly known, including heroin, and those around him were often shocked that he survived as long as he did. Behind the fame and success, his final years were marked by a quiet, escalating fight that took a heavy toll on both his body and his spirit. George Michael died on Christmas 2016. By 2012, George Michael had scored his final major UK hit and quietly stepped back from the public eye. Aside from a handful of appearances, he lived increasingly privately. Yet every December his presence returned inescapably. His voice filled shops, radios, and living rooms around the world. Through Wham's Last Christmas, and his role in Band-Aid's Do They Know It's Christmas? Songs that had become part of the season itself. That's what made what came next feel almost unbearably cruel. On Christmas Day 2016, while his music was still bringing warmth and nostalgia to millions, George Michael was gone. That morning, his partner, Fadi Fawaz, went to Michael's home in Oxfordshire. They had planned to spend Christmas lunch together. Instead, Fawaz found him lying peacefully in bed, as if asleep. Paramedics and police were called, and while the death was unexpected, there were no signs of violence or foul play. For weeks, the world waited for answers, left in a strange limbo between shock and disbelief. In March 2017, the truth was finally confirmed. A coroner announced that George Michael had died at the age of 53 from natural causes, the result of heart disease and liver problems. There was no dramatic final incident, no hidden crime, just a body worn down after years of physical strain, illness, and quiet battles few fully understood. The timing only deepened the heartbreak. A man whose voice defined Christmas for generations died on the very day his songs continued to make others smile. George Michael attempted to end his life several times. The official explanation for George Michael's sudden death in December 2016 was medical. A coroner's report later confirmed that he died at age 53 from natural causes, citing a fatty liver along with serious heart conditions, including dilated cardiomyopathy and myocarditis. On paper, the case was closed, but for those closest to him, the story never felt that simple. Michael's partner at the time, Fadi Fawaz, publicly questioned the idea that his death was purely natural. Speaking from his own experience living with Michael, Fawaz suggested that the singer's long-standing emotional struggles and the timing of his death pointed to something darker. Fawaz noted that George died on Christmas Day, which also happened to be his mother's birthday. Her death in 1997 had devastated him and marked one of the deepest depressions of his life. To Fawaz, that coincidence was impossible to ignore. He went further, claiming that Michael had attempted to take his own life several times before, implying that years of inner pain may have played a role in how his life ultimately ended. Those claims were never supported by official findings, and authorities stood by the coroner's conclusion. Still, the contrast between the clinical cause of death and the emotional reality described by those who loved him has kept questions alive. In the end, George Michael's passing remains defined by two parallel truths: what medicine could explain and what heartbreak could not. What do you believe truly broke George Michael in the end? His failing health, the loss of those he loved, or years of unspoken pain? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want more in-depth stories uncovering the real lives behind the legends, make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more content like this.